Introduction. The Protagonist and Her World. My name is Amy, and a few months ago my life fell apart. Everything that seemed stable and familiar vanished in an instant. My husband, with whom I'd been together for nearly 10 years, told me he no longer wanted to be married. Without warning, without any explanation, he left. I found myself alone in an empty house with the harsh realization that my life would never be the same again. At first, I couldn't believe it. I tried to cope, telling myself it was just a temporary trial, that we would work it out. But no matter how hard I tried, each day brought no relief. Everything reminded me of him, our shared past, the things we had collected together, the memories I desperately tried to erase from my mind. The house became my prison. I felt completely lost. Weeks passed and I finally realized that I needed to change my life. I decided that I had to start fresh, move far away, to a new place, somewhere no one would remind me of the past, somewhere I could rediscover who I really was. I found a small apartment in the suburbs. It was an old building, lacking modern conveniences, but it had a spacious, cozy feel that somehow immediately felt like home. Spacious, yet slightly abandoned. There were no memories of the past here, and that was probably the most important thing. When I moved in, everything seemed perfect. I thought that finally I could turn the page of my life, but something was wrong. At first, everything went well. I settled in, arranged the apartment, made it cozy in my own way. But with each passing day, I began to feel that something was off. It wasn't fear or anxiety, it was something stranger. There was something strange about this house. It was too quiet. There was no life in it. It felt like time had slowed down and the air wasn't just empty, but heavy. I tried to convince myself that it was just the result of stress, that I was just overreacting. But every evening, when I returned home, I felt that strange cold creeping into my soul. And this was just the beginning. The first strange occurrences. A few days had passed since I moved into the new house, and to be honest, I had already gotten used to its silence and solitude. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. I unpacked my things, began arranging the space. But soon, somewhere around the fourth or fifth day, the strange occurrences began. Not immediately noticeable, but definitely something was off. At first it was just sounds, soft, faint, like someone was tiptoeing down the hallway. I thought it was the wind or maybe the sounds of an old house, which, of course, couldn't be completely silent. But as each day passed, the sounds became more apparent. Rustling, creaking, as though some invisible presence was hiding in the corner. I tried to track where they were coming from, but as soon as I would get up and go to the hallway or the room, they would vanish. Only silence remained. At night it became especially intense. I couldn't tell if these sounds were real or if I was imagining them. One night I got up to check what might be wrong, but as soon as I stepped toward the door, the silence returned, as if everything that had been happening was just in my mind. Over time I began to realize that the sounds always came from one place, the dark corner of my living room. This corner was somewhat hidden. I had never really paid attention to it until it became clear that everything was coming from there. It was so dark that even with the lights off, it was hard for me to make out what was there. That evening, when I heard the creaking again, I couldn't stay in bed. I got up, almost mechanically, heading toward that corner. But as soon as I reached the door, all the sounds stopped. Strange, isn't it? I tried to logically explain it to myself. Maybe it's the stress, the move, all these changes affecting my perception. I decided that my nervous system just couldn't handle the pressure, and I needed some time to adjust. However, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something in this house that I just couldn't understand. Something waiting for me in the dark corners. Unexplainable sensations. Several weeks had passed since I first started noticing the strange sounds, but with each passing day, I became more and more unsure that it was just the result of stress. Suddenly, sensations began to appear that couldn't be explained. It was something more than just rustling or creaking in the house. It was the feeling that I wasn't alone. I started feeling a presence. At first it was a vague sense, as if someone was nearby, but I couldn't see them. Often when I sat on the couch or stood by the window, it felt like someone was standing next to me. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a real presence, pressing down on me as if someone was watching. I noticed that I often felt someone's breath on the back of my neck, so close that I wanted to turn around, but as soon as I did, there was nothing there. Sometimes I felt something lightly touch my shoulder, as if someone gently placed a hand on me, but when I raised my hand to brush away the cold, there was nothing. These moments were strange, frightening, and confusing. At first, I tried to convince myself that this was just a result of my isolation, of the stress I had been through, that it was all a product of my imagination. I had been so lonely, so exhausted from having my world shattered. I tried to think that my imagination was overloaded, that this was just a psychosis brought on by my solitude. I tried to ignore these sensations as best as I could, but they kept growing stronger. One evening, when I was sitting in the kitchen, I felt a sudden chill. I sensed something strange cutting through the air. In that moment, I heard it, a whisper. It was barely audible, soft, but undeniably present in the room. The whisper was so clear that I felt as if it was someone's voice right behind me. "Amy?" I quickly spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no one there, silence. I stood frozen in bewilderment, as if I had somehow deceived myself, but deep inside, something wouldn't let me shake the unease. I checked the kitchen again, peering into the dark corners, but everything was as it had been. This was the moment when I first truly felt fear. Now I wasn't sure that any of this could be explained logically. With each new night, with every new strange moment, it became harder and harder to convince myself that I wasn't losing my mind. Something was in this house, something that was watching me, and whatever it was, it felt too real to simply ignore. The strangeness becomes more apparent. Over time, the strangeness began to become more and more obvious. I could no longer chalk it all up to stress or nervous tension. It was happening too often, and there were too many things that couldn't be explained. One night, I came home late and noticed that the door to my bedroom was open. I clearly remembered it being closed when I left in the morning. This couldn't have been a mere coincidence. I checked to make sure I had closed it before leaving the house, and I was certain I had. I stood in the hallway feeling a chill creep down my spine. I approached the door and closed it again, my fist clenched with worry. But this was only the beginning. The next day, returning home, I noticed that a few items on the kitchen shelf were out of place. The same kettle I had left on one side of the table was now on the opposite side. Books that I had definitely put on the shelf were now in a completely different spot. At first I thought I must have just forgotten where I placed them, but with each new instance, I became more and more convinced that something invisible, was moving these things. And the sounds, they were getting louder. Rustling, footsteps on the floor, creaks as if an invisible person was running around the house. I often heard something heavy moving in the dark corner of my living room, as if someone was hiding there. Every time I tried to check where the sounds were coming from, they would suddenly stop. But the feeling that something was there never left me. One night, when I once again heard strange footsteps and a faint sound, as if someone was moving furniture in the corner, I decided that I couldn't just sit there and ignore it. I grabbed my phone and went to my neighbours, hoping to get some answers. My neighbour, an elderly woman who lived next door, looked at me with surprise when I asked her about the strange occurrences in the house. "Are you out of your mind?" she said, laughing. "This house has been here for 20 years and I've lived here all that time, and nothing like this has ever happened. It's always been quiet." She even mentioned that she herself had once heard strange noises but had chalked it up to the old building. Nothing strange, just old walls, you know? I tried to learn more about the history of the house, but no one could give me a clear answer. The rental office had no documents about the building's past, and the local archives were strangely outdated. Everything seemed very confusing. One man who worked in property management even told me this house hasn't been under control for a long time, and that its fate is unknown. But even he couldn't give a concrete explanation. I felt the fear begin to overtake me. Was this just my nerves playing tricks on me, or was there something in this house that I couldn't understand? The strangeness was becoming more and more evident, and the answers to my questions were becoming more and more vague. Psychological tension and growing anxiety. With each passing day, I felt my perception of reality becoming more and more distorted. I started to doubt my own mind. It felt like a slow but inevitable disappearance of confidence in what was happening around me. I tried to convince myself that all of this was just the result of stress, that I was simply unable to cope with what I had been through. But the moments I experienced were too real to be explained away so simply. The feelings of presence became increasingly aggressive. It was no longer just a sense that someone was watching me. I began to feel as though someone was gradually invading my space more and more every day. It was as if someone wasn't just watching, but was intentionally planning something. The sensation was so strong that at times I felt the air around me growing heavy, and the shadow in the corner of the living room seemed not just like a shadow. It was as if it concealed something alive, waiting for me, ready to move. Sometimes it seemed like I heard a whisper, but it wasn't clear. It was as though someone whispered a word with the intent to frighten. In these moments, I began to wonder if there really was something to all of this, or if my mind was slowly falling apart. Fear began to overwhelm me. It filled my house, my life. I started avoiding dark corners in the room, not going into closets or storage spaces, afraid that something might jump out from there. Especially at night. Every night I woke up at the slightest noise, and each time it seemed like something was moving in the dark corners, places where I couldn't make anything out. I would lie in bed, straining to listen to the sounds in the house, as if something was walking across the floor. And even though I acted calm, the anxiety inside me kept growing. Fear became my constant companion. When I tried to sleep, I couldn't turn off my thoughts, and in the dark, every movement, every creak seemed far more sinister. I started to fear turning off the lights. It was a horrible feeling, not being able to rid myself of that sensation. I kept the nightlight on all night despite the exhaustion. My body was begging for rest, but I couldn't allow myself to fall asleep in the dark. It was as if I was afraid that if I closed my eyes, something unknown would come for me. No matter how much I tried to convince myself that this was just stress and the aftermath of what I had been through, my body felt something else. Each day, it became harder to think about anything other than what was happening in this house. I was afraid to be alone, but the more I tried to shut out my fears, the more they crept into me, slowly driving me mad. The disappearance of items and signs of presence. Over time, the strangeness in the house only intensified. I could no longer ignore what was happening. It wasn't just a feeling that something was wrong. Now I began to notice that some things, which I was sure I had left in their places, simply disappeared. Things that mattered to me, important items, started vanishing without a trace. At first it was small things. A favourite cup that I would leave on the table after breakfast disappeared, and I thought maybe I just forgot where I put it. But then more important things started disappearing. One day, I couldn't find my phone in its usual spot on the nightstand. I clearly remembered placing it next to the bed when I went to sleep. I searched the whole apartment, but couldn't find it. A few hours later, when I returned to the bedroom, it was back in its place, as though it had never disappeared. I tried to convince myself that maybe I was just mistaken and hadn't noticed that I put it somewhere else. But before I could convince myself that it was just my forgetfulness, other strange things began happening. Items on the shelves started to move. The same phone that had been on the nightstand was now on a table in another room. My books, which I always kept neatly arranged, were scattered around as though someone had been rummaging through them. I worried that maybe someone had been entering my house without my knowledge, but the door was always locked, and I always carried my keys with me. One evening, late at night, I noticed strange marks on the floor in the hallway. I thought maybe it was something I had accidentally dropped, but no matter how hard I tried to find an explanation, the marks were clearly too heavy. As though someone had moved something very large. It was strange, and I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I checked all the rooms but found nothing, and when I returned to the hallway, the marks had vanished. They had simply disappeared, as if they had never existed. But the most terrifying moment came when something happened at night. I woke up with a strange feeling that something was wrong. Opening my eyes, I saw that there was an item on the table beside my bed that I clearly remembered. It had been on the shelf in another room, and I hadn't touched it for several days. It was my old ring, which I had left on the shelf when I first moved in. It was lying in front of me as if it had never disappeared. But how could it be on this table, if I was certain I had left it in a different place? My hands shook, and I felt that same coldness fill my body. I couldn't understand what was happening. My mind couldn't find an explanation for it. Everything I had considered normal was now collapsing like a house of cards. Reality began to blur, and I didn't know where it ended or what was really happening. It was a moment when I realised that I could no longer trust myself. This wasn't my imagination. Everything happening in this house was real, and it was too terrifying to ignore. The turning point, whispers, and night visions. One night, I woke up with a strange sensation, like something in the room had changed. My eyes were just beginning to adjust to the darkness when I saw it. A dark figure standing in the corner of my bedroom. This wasn't just a shadow playing on the wall. No, it was something alive. something that clearly didn't belong in this world. The figure was humanoid, but its contours were distorted, as if its outline were melting, yet still too defined to be just a play of light. The air turned cold and the atmosphere in the room became thick, and it seemed to me that it was watching me, not moving. I lay still, unable to move. The feeling of its presence was so strong that it filled the entire room. I was sure it was there, right beside me. My heart raced faster, and I felt my hair stand on end. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. But when I tried to move, to turn around, the figure remained in the same place, as though it was waiting for me to make the first move. The sense of unease and fear became unbearable. I forced myself to get up, and despite the terror, I approached the figure. I moved slowly, each step making it harder to breathe. In that moment, as I took a step towards it, the figure vanished. It just disappeared, as if it had never been there. I stood frozen, trying to understand what had just happened. My heart pounded in my chest. And then I heard it, the whisper. It wasn't loud, more like a faint sound, but I could clearly tell. This wasn't just my imagination. The whisper came from that very corner where the figure had just been. The voice was familiar, somehow warm but terrifying. It spoke my name. Amy. I jolted, my body trembling. The whisper was so real that I could feel its vibration in my chest. I looked around the room, hoping to see something that would explain what was happening. But again, nothing. The same empty corner, the same dark, ominous corner. Since then, I haven't been able to shake the feeling. The figure and its whispers began to invade my dreams. Each time I fell asleep, it became more vivid, more tangible. At first, I saw it only in the dark corners of my room, but then it started appearing in my dreams, as if it were a part of my subconscious. In my dreams, it would stand next to me in the shadows, and I could no longer tell it apart from reality. With each new dream, its face became more familiar, as if I had seen it before, but couldn't remember from where. What was it? A creature, a ghost, or my own shattered perception of reality? With each passing day, this figure became not just part of my nightmares, but also part of my waking life. I couldn't escape the feeling that it was watching me, not just in the dark corners, but also in the depths of my mind. Perception crisis. Who is she really? With each passing day, it became harder and harder for me to distinguish reality from nightmares. At first, I tried to explain all the strangeness to myself, thinking it was just the result of stress, that my mind couldn't cope with what I had gone through. I tried so hard to justify everything that, at one point, I began to doubt my own sanity. But the strangeness didn't stop. On the contrary, it became more vivid, more ominous. I couldn't handle it anymore. Every night I woke up, and each night felt more real than the last. The figure in the corner, the dark shadow I kept seeing more and more frequently, became clearer and clearer. The whispers, her name, which she softly said, as if whispering in my ear, didn't let me rest even during the day. I stopped understanding what was really happening, and what I was making up. It felt like my reality was starting to crack. I decided that I needed help. I sat down and wrote all my thoughts, trying to convince myself that I wasn't losing my mind. That's how I ended up in the office of a psychologist. I explained to her that lately I had been experiencing strange things, that I often heard a voice, saw a shadow in the corner, and that objects were disappearing and reappearing. She listened attentively and told me that it was most likely the result of stress and depression. My mind, she said, was reacting to the loss I had experienced, and these visions might be manifestations of my subconscious trying to cope with grief. That should have comforted me. But instead it made me feel even more anxious, because even after her words I still heard the whispers, saw the figure in the corner, felt its presence. This couldn't just be a product of my imagination. Not to this extent. With each day, with each new nightmare, reality became more and more distorted. I could no longer tell what was true and what wasn't. Sometimes it seemed that the figure in the corner wasn't just a ghost, not just a product of my mind, but something more. I couldn't separate the two. Maybe this figure was controlling my perception of reality. Maybe it was making me see and feel things that weren't actually there. Or, on the other hand, was it trying to show me a truth that I couldn't comprehend? What if all of this wasn't happening in my mind, but in the house itself? What if this house was somehow connected to what was happening to me. It seemed like every step I took in this place led me deeper into a labyrinth with no exit. I began to think that the figure in the corner wasn't just something I saw, it was something that had intruded into my life, and I couldn't understand why it had chosen me. This wasn't just a reflection of my fear or pain, it was something alive, something that existed outside of my mind. With each passing day, I lost my grip on reality. And although I tried to hold on to the psychologist's words, that it was just my mind and stress, I was no longer sure that all of this was just an illusion. The climax, uncovering the secrets of the house. I could no longer ignore what was happening in this house. My attempts to rationalise all these events could no longer conceal the obvious. Something was wrong. This place, this space, everything around me had become foreign and sinister. I couldn't calm down, I couldn't find an explanation for what was happening, and I realised that if I wanted to understand what was going on, I needed to dig into the history of this house. I began searching on the internet, in the city archives, even with the neighbours, everywhere I could find even the faintest traces. And finally I stumbled upon something. In one of the old newspaper clippings, I found several mentions of the house I was living in. In the photographs I found, there were images of previous residents, several families over the years, and one chilling mention. The information about the house seemed fragmentary, but everything pointed to one thing. All the previous tenants, everyone who had ever lived in this house, reported strange, unexplainable occurrences. Noises at night, missing objects, disappearing people. Several people had left this house, leaving only fear and anxiety behind, but no one could explain what had really happened here. One day I came across a document that made me stop. It was dated over 40 years ago, and it was a report on incidents that had occurred in the house. It mentioned that a tragedy had taken place here. Mysterious disappearances, strange events that could not be explained. No one knew exactly what had happened, but there were rumours that the house had been built on a site where violent events had occurred before, possibly murders or other horrific incidents. At that moment, I felt the ground slip away from beneath my feet. Everything I had experienced, everything that had happened to me in this house, now seemed like it wasn't a coincidence. I wasn't the only one suffering from these phenomena. It had happened here before, and it was perhaps connected to those who had lived here before me. But now I didn't know what was scarier, what had happened to this house, or what was happening to my mind. My perception of the world finally began to crumble. All these figures, whispers, disappearing objects. I couldn't tell what was real anymore, and what was the result of my mind trying to justify its fear, its loss. I began to think that these ghosts and occurrences were not external, but were products of my subconscious, my way of coping with what I had lost, with what I couldn't leave behind in the past. My mind was trying to compensate for the pain by creating these images, these whispers, these faces to help me cope with the grief. But despite these thoughts, every morning I woke up with the same feeling. I couldn't shake the thought that something in this house was truly controlling me, my thoughts, my actions. Someone or something was manipulating me. These feelings, these visions, couldn't just be products of my imagination. Everything that was happening was too real. I could no longer trust my perception. And perhaps the most terrifying thing was that I didn't know what would happen next. With each passing day, with every new discovery about the house, I felt more and more that I was becoming a part of something much bigger than I could have ever imagined. And I didn't know if I would be able to escape this nightmare, if it was truly a part of me. Conclusion. Open ending. I was on the brink. My mind seemed to have reached its limit with these nightmares, these visions, these whispers. I decided that I needed to leave. I could no longer stay in this house, in this place that was consuming my peace and tearing me apart from the inside. I wasn't sure anymore that everything happening was just my mind playing tricks on me. It had become something more than just pain. It was like a heavy burden I couldn't shake off. I packed my things and decided to leave. But at the moment I tried to leave the house, I felt the air in the hallway grow heavy, as if something invisible was holding me back. I approached the door and froze, staring at its old surface, as though it was hiding something. I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. I pushed it again and again, but the door remained locked. That's when I realised I couldn't leave. This place wouldn't let me go. My hands began to shake, and I knew I couldn't move any longer. I looked around and felt everything around me start to warp. The sounds I heard were growing louder. The figure that had been waiting for me in the corner reappeared in my sight, but now its silhouette was clearer than ever. I understood that it was here again, as if it wouldn't let me leave, as if this house had a hold on me. Now I didn't know what was worse, to be trapped in my own crumbling mind, day by day, or to be trapped by something supernatural that I couldn't comprehend. My mind was losing its grip with every passing hour, but at the same time, I sensed that here, in this house, there was something greater, something that wouldn't let me go. I sat down again on the floor, leaning against the wall, and despite all my despair, I realised that perhaps I would never leave this place. It didn't matter if it was my perception, slowly unravelling, or the reality I was stuck in. In this house, among its dark corners and unseen presences, I understood that I would never be able to tell one from the other. And perhaps I would remain here forever, in this place, trapped. By my mind or by something much more terrifying than I could ever have imagined. The end, but not the end. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new creepy tales. Share your thoughts in the comments. We value your opinion. Bye for now. See you in the next video.